I was dressing for my son's wedding when a lawyer texted, "Stop everything. Read this now." I was standing in a hotel suite at the Ritz-Carlton in Atlanta when my phone vibrated again. "Call me immediately. This cannot wait." My son's wedding was less than 2 hours away. The ballroom downstairs already filling with guests in their best clothes, laughter rising like nothing in the world could go wrong. And yet, in that quiet moment, I felt something shift, something cold, something I could not explain. When I finally answered the call, the lawyer's voice was tight, urgent, almost shaking, and she said words I will never forget. "Your son is not just getting married today, Mrs. Collins. He is about to sign something you were never meant to see." And in that instant, everything I thought I knew about my family began to fracture. I stood there, frozen, holding my dress in one hand, the phone in the other, feeling like the ground beneath me had quietly disappeared. Only if this story truly resonates with you, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from in the world and what time it is in your city right now, because I have learned that stories like this do not belong to just one place. They belong to anyone who has ever trusted someone too deeply. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 67 years old, and what happened on the day of my son Daniel's wedding did not just change my family. It changed the way I understand love, loyalty, and silence inside a family that looks perfect from the outside. I remember standing in that hotel room overlooking downtown Atlanta, the glass windows reflecting a woman I barely recognized, carefully dressed, carefully composed, pretending that everything was normal while something inside me already knew it was not. The air smelled like fresh flowers from the arrangements downstairs, lilies and roses mixed with expensive perfume, the kind of setting where people believe nothing bad can possibly happen. But my phone would not stop vibrating, and every message felt heavier than the last. I finally called the number back, stepping closer to the window, my voice low as I said, "This is Margaret." There was a pause. Then the lawyer spoke again, Laura Bennett, her tone controlled but urgent, saying, "Mrs. Collins, I need you to listen very carefully. Your son Daniel has entered into a trust restructuring agreement, and it involves assets that were once under your name." I frowned, confused, and said, "That is not possible. Daniel would never do something like that without telling me." And that is when she said something that made my hand tighten around the phone. "I am afraid he already has." Downstairs, I could hear music beginning to play, guests arriving, the soft sound of a wedding day beginning to unfold like a promise. I looked at my reflection again and whispered, almost to myself, "He is getting married in an hour. What exactly are you trying to tell me?" The lawyer exhaled slowly, then said, "There are documents being finalized today, during the ceremony itself. If they are signed, certain control over your late husband's estate will shift permanently." For a moment, I could not speak. My husband Richard had been gone for 6 years, and every decision since then had felt like I was just trying to hold our family together with whatever pieces were left. I said quietly, "Daniel would never use his wedding for something like this." But even as I said it, I heard the doubt in my own voice, a small crack I did not want to admit existed. Laura responded, "I did not believe it either, Mrs. Collins, until I saw the filing myself. And there is something else. I think you need to understand who else is involved." I turned away from the window, my heart beating faster now, and asked, "Who?" There was another pause, longer this time, and then she said, "His fiancé's family is not just attending the wedding, they are financing it." The words did not make sense at first, like pieces of a puzzle that refused to connect. I walked slowly toward the chair, sitting down as if my body had suddenly become too heavy to stand. "Financing?" I repeated. "What does that even mean?" Laura's voice softened slightly, as if she knew what she was about to say would not be easy to hear. "It means this wedding is also a business arrangement, and your husband's estate is part of the equation." I remember laughing once, not because it was funny, but because it felt like my mind was refusing to accept what I was hearing. "That is ridiculous," I said. "My son is not part of some arrangement." But even as I said it, my phone lit up again with another message, this time from Daniel himself. "Mom, please do not come downstairs yet. I will explain everything after the ceremony." I stared at those words for a long time. Do not come downstairs. At my son's wedding, something inside me went still, not angry yet, not emotional, just deeply alert in a way I had not felt in years. Laura's voice returned, lower now, almost cautious. Mrs. Collins, there is something you should know before you walk into that ballroom. Your name appears on a clause that you did not authorize. And according to the timeline, someone had to sign it on your behalf. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of that sentence settle into my chest. The ballroom music grew louder downstairs, laughter rising, glasses clinking, a world celebrating something I was suddenly no longer sure I was part of. I stood up slowly, walked back toward the mirror, and for the first time that morning, I felt something unfamiliar, replacing confusion. It was clarity. And then Laura said the final words that changed everything. Mrs. Collins, I think your son's wedding is not what you think it is. And I need you to understand who actually owns the moment you are about to walk into. And just as I was about to ask what she meant, I heard a knock at the hotel door behind me, slow, deliberate, and completely unexpected. The knock at the hotel door lingered in the air like a held breath that refused to leave the room, and I remember standing there, my hand still frozen near the edge of the chair, my mind trying to decide whether the world outside that door was real or already collapsing into something I did not yet understand. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I listened. Another knock came, softer this time, almost respectful, as if whoever stood there already knew they were interrupting a life that was about to fracture. Mrs. Collins, a voice called gently, "It is Laura Bennett. Please open the door." I exhaled slowly, as if my lungs had forgotten how to release air properly, and walked toward it. When I opened the door, she stood there in a dark navy blazer, holding a thin leather folder against her chest like it weighed more than paper should. Her expression was not dramatic, not emotional, but controlled in the way people look when they have already seen too much truth to be surprised by anything else. "You should sit down," she said quietly. I stepped aside, letting her in, and I replied, "This is my son's wedding day. I do not think I have the luxury of sitting down." That made her pause, just for a second, before she nodded and said, "Then I will stand with you." I closed the door behind her, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, filled with the distant sound of music from downstairs, faint laughter rising through the hotel walls, like a reminder that life was still pretending to be normal. I finally asked, "What is happening, Laura?" "Start from the beginning." She opened the folder slowly, as if each page had to be treated with care, and said, "This did not begin today. It began 2 years ago." The words hit me harder than I expected, not because of what they meant, but because of what they confirmed. Something long, something hidden, something I had not been allowed to see. She continued, "Your son Daniel entered into a series of financial restructuring agreements after his acquisition deal in Atlanta did not perform as expected. There were liabilities, significant ones, tied to his business partner's exit." I frowned slightly, my voice lower now. "Daniel told me everything was fine." Laura looked up at me briefly. That is what most people in his position say when they are trying to stabilize what is already unstable. I sat down then, not because I wanted to, but because the weight of her words made standing feel unnecessary. I looked at my hands, noticing for the first time how still they were, how trained they had become to remain calm even when nothing inside me felt calm at all. "And the trust?" I asked. She nodded once. "That is where it becomes complicated. There is a family trust connected to your late husband's estate. It was originally designed to protect your financial independence, but over time, amendments were made. Quietly, without your direct acknowledgement." I felt a small tightening in my chest, not panic, but recognition. Memory does that sometimes. It pulls threads you did not know were loose. I thought about the months after my husband Richard passed away, the paperwork, the phone calls, the long evenings where Daniel insisted he would handle everything so I would not be burdened. I remember saying, "I can still read documents, Daniel," and he smiled and said, "I know you can. Mom, I just want you to rest." Laura's voice pulled me back. "There is something else," she said. "The amendment was executed in a jurisdiction outside of your primary state residence. That means it does not follow the usual probate oversight." I let out a slow breath. "Where?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. "Delaware." I nodded slightly, not because I fully understood it, but because I understood enough to know it was intentional. Delaware was not random. Nothing in legal structuring like this ever was. I leaned back in the chair and said quietly, "So, my son is involved in moving pieces of my husband's estate through another state without telling me." Laura did not correct me. She only said, He may not be the only one directing it. That sentence sat in the air longer than anything else she had said. I looked at her and asked, "Then who is?" Before she could answer, my phone vibrated again on the table between us. A message from Daniel. "Mom, I need you to trust me today. Please do not speak to anyone else about legal matters." I stared at the screen, reading it twice, then a third time. Trust me today. As if trust could be scheduled like a ceremony, as if trust had not already been the foundation of everything that had brought me to that room. Laura noticed my expression and said softly, "There is something about today that you need to understand. The wedding is not only a celebration, it is also a consolidation event. Certain documents become active once both families are present and witnesses are in place." I looked up at her. "Witnesses?" She nodded. High-value estate transfers often use ceremonial presence as a form of legal reinforcement. It is rare, but it is enforceable under specific conditions. I almost laughed then, but it did not come out as humor. It came out as disbelief. "You are telling me my son's wedding is also a legal transaction?" I asked. Laura answered carefully, "I am telling you that your presence here today is not accidental in the structure of what is being executed." A long silence followed. Downstairs, the music shifted slightly, a new song beginning, something slower, something that sounded like it was meant for walking down an aisle. I stood again, slowly, walking toward the window. Atlanta stretched beneath us, bright and indifferent, as if nothing in my world was changing at all. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Laura stepped closer, her voice lower, "Because there is one more signature required. And once it happens, it cannot be reversed without immediate legal intervention." I turned to her. "Whose signature?" She looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Yours." And in that instant, everything I thought I understood about the day ahead stopped feeling like a wedding at all and started feeling like something else entirely, something carefully arranged, something waiting for me to walk directly into it, without knowing that I had already been placed at the center of it long before I ever received that first message. Laura's words still lingered in the air like something unfinished, something that refused to settle. And I remember standing by the window of that hotel suite in Atlanta, watching the city move below as if nothing in my world had shifted, yet everything inside me had already begun to rearrange itself in ways I could not control. And then the door opened again, not with a knock this time, but with the quiet certainty of someone who believed they owned the space they were entering. And a young woman stepped in, elegant, composed, wearing a soft ivory dress that looked like it belonged to the wedding downstairs, her presence immediately filling the room in a way that felt less like arrival and more like declaration. And Laura turned slightly and said under her breath, "Mrs. Collins, this is Hannah Whitmore." And I understood at once that this was Daniel's fiancée, the woman whose name had been mentioned in fragments but never fully explained to me. And Hannah smiled, but it was not a warm smile. It was controlled, measured, the kind of smile people use when they are trying to decide how much respect you deserve before you even speak. And she looked at me and said, "So you are the mother," as if the word mother itself needed clarification in her mind. And I answered quietly, "Yes." And for a moment no one moved, until she walked further into the room, her eyes scanning the folder in Laura's hand. And she said, "We are on a schedule downstairs. So whatever this is, it needs to be quick." And there was something in her tone that made the air feel tighter, as if time itself belonged to her and not to the rest of us. And I felt Laura shift slightly beside me, protective but restrained. And I asked Hannah, "Do you know what is happening today?" And she tilted her head slightly, almost amused, and said, "Of course I do. I am getting married." And then she added, "And Daniel is finally securing his future the way it should have been secured a long time ago." And those words landed differently than she intended, because I heard something underneath them, not confidence, but possession. And Laura stepped forward and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, there are legal documents involved that your family has not disclosed in full transparency." And Hannah let out a small breath of impatience and replied, "My father has handled everything." And that was the first time I felt the shape of something larger behind her, something structured, something organized. And I asked, "Your father?" And she nodded slightly as if it were obvious. "He oversees the financial side of everything important in our family." And I felt a subtle shift inside me, not fear yet, but recognition of pattern, because I had seen families like that before in different contexts, where control does not arrive loudly but arrives with structure, And then Hannah looked at me more directly and said, "With respect, Mrs. Collins, this is not really your concern anymore." And I remember those words landing with a strange weight, not because they were cruel, but because they were said with certainty, as if I had already been removed from the story and simply had not realized it yet. And Laura immediately responded, "That is not legally accurate." But Hannah did not look at her. She looked at me, and she said, "Daniel told me you were struggling with accepting boundaries." And I felt something inside me pause, because that was not something I had ever said to Daniel, not in those words. And I asked quietly, "When did he say that?" And she smiled again, softer this time, but sharper underneath. And she said, "He says a lot of things when he is trying to keep everyone calm." And then she stepped closer to the table and placed her hand lightly on the edge of the folder, not touching it fully, just enough to signal interest, control, familiarity. And she said, "Whatever trust issues exist, my family has already agreed to absorb them into the larger structure." And Laura immediately said, "That is not how fiduciary responsibility works under this jurisdiction." And Hannah finally turned to her fully, her voice lowering. "You are just a lawyer, correct?" And the way she said it was not a question, it was a reduction, and I saw Laura's expression tighten, but she stayed calm, and she replied, "I am the attorney who reviewed the amendment your family filed in Wilmington." And for the first time, Hannah's expression changed slightly, not fear, but calculation, and she said, "Wilmington filings are standard for asset protection." And then she added something that made the room go still without anyone realizing it immediately, especially when there are legacy liabilities involved. And Laura's head turned sharply toward her, and she said, "What did you just call them?" And Hannah paused, just a fraction too long, as if she had said something she did not intend to expose, and she responded, "That is just how my father refers to long-term estate exposure." And I felt something inside me shift again, because the word exposure did not belong in a wedding conversation, not like that, not casually. And Laura opened the folder fully now and said, "Mrs. Collins, I need you to look at this clause." And, as she pointed to a line of text, I heard footsteps outside in the hallway, multiple voices, laughter rising faintly, guests moving closer to the ballroom, unaware of anything happening above them. And Laura continued, "This clause requires immediate acknowledgement from you in order for the final transfer authorization to activate." And I looked at the document, but before I could focus on it, Hannah leaned slightly forward and said, almost casually, "Daniel said you would understand eventually, that you always did things the hard way." And something about that sentence struck deeper than anything before it, not because it was insulting, but because it was familiar, like a memory I had not yet fully recovered. And I asked her, "How long have you known about this?" And she hesitated, just briefly, and then said, "Long enough to know it is already in motion." And in that moment, Laura's hand tightened on the folder, and she whispered, "No, not to Hannah, not to me, but to herself," as if she had just seen something she had not expected. And I followed her eyes down to the signature line on the page, where a name appeared that made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain immediately, because it was not Daniel's name, and it was not mine, but Richard Collins. And I felt the room tilt slightly as I said, "That is not possible." And Hannah finally smiled fully this time, as if she had been waiting for that exact reaction, and she said, "It has already been approved through legacy verification." And Laura stepped back slightly, her voice suddenly urgent, "Mrs. Collins, this changes everything." And I looked at both of them, the fiancé standing too calm, the lawyer suddenly unsettled. And I realized that whatever I had walked into today was not only about my son, not only about a wedding, but about something that had already been written long before I arrived. And then Hannah said the words that froze everything completely, "We just need your confirmation now." And then the entire estate history closes cleanly. And at that exact moment, my phone vibrated again on the table, one new message lighting up the screen, and it was from Daniel. But this time, it did not say what I expected. It simply said, "Mom, do not sign anything, not even if they tell you it is already yours." And I looked up slowly, realizing for the first time that my son was not only part of this situation, he was warning me from inside it. The silence in the hotel suite did not break. It deepened, like the air itself had decided to stop moving. And I remember standing there with my phone still glowing in my hand, Daniel's message repeating in my mind like something I could not fully interpret yet. While Hannah Whitmore watched me with that same controlled calm, and Laura Bennett stayed half a step behind me as if she was preparing for something she could not yet predict. And then the moment shifted again, not from inside the room this time, but from the hallway outside, where footsteps stopped at the door and did not continue, as if whoever stood there had already decided they belonged inside without needing permission. And before anyone could speak, the door opened, not quickly, not hesitantly, but with the steady certainty of someone accustomed to rooms falling silent when they enter, and a man stepped in, older, likely in his early 70s, dressed in a dark tailored suit that carried the quiet weight of authority rather than decoration, his presence not loud, but absolute. And he paused the moment his eyes adjusted to the room, scanning slowly, not at Hannah, not at Laura first, but at me, and I saw something change in his expression, not confusion, not curiosity, but recognition, deep and immediate, like a memory being pulled from a place it had never fully left. And he said softly, almost under his breath, "No, it cannot be." And Laura turned sharply toward him, saying, "Sir, you need to identify yourself." But he did not answer her, not yet, because his focus had already locked onto me, and I felt something inside me tighten, not fear, but familiarity I could not place at first. And then he stepped forward one pace, then another, until he was standing just inside the room, and he said again, slower this time, "Margaret Collins." And hearing my name spoken like that, with that tone, made something in my past move, something buried beneath years of distance and silence, and I replied cautiously, "Do I know you?" And he let out a breath that sounded almost like disbelief, and said, "You do not remember me." And then he added, "But I remember you very well." And Hannah shifted slightly, her confidence thinning just enough for it to be noticeable, and she said, "Excuse me, this is a private matter." But the man did not look at her, and instead turned slightly toward Laura and asked, "Are you counsel?" And Laura answered carefully, "Yes," and he nodded once, as if confirming something he already suspected. And then he said, "Then I suggest you stop whatever transfer you are attempting to validate." And the word suggest carried more weight than any command I had heard that day, and Laura's eyes narrowed slightly as she said, "And you are?" And he finally exhaled fully, as if deciding there was no longer any reason to remain unclear, and said, "Retired Rear Admiral Thomas Grayson, United States Navy Judge Advocate General Corps." And the room changed immediately, not emotionally, but structurally, like the introduction of a new variable that rearranges every equation. And I saw Hannah's expression flicker for the first time, just briefly, and Laura stepped back half an inch without meaning to, and the Admiral continued. "And I strongly advise you all to understand that you are currently attempting to execute a legal action that intersects with federal-level protected estate history." And I felt my heartbeat slow slightly, not because I understood everything, but because I understood enough to know that this was no longer a private family issue. And Hannah finally spoke again, her voice tighter now. "With respect, Admiral, this is a civilian wedding and private trust matter." And he turned his eyes to her for the first time, and I saw something in his gaze that was not anger, but disappointment, controlled and precise. And he said, "Young lady, I have reviewed classified estate frameworks less complicated than what is sitting in this room right now." And then he looked back at me, and for a moment the noise of the world outside, the music, the guests, the celebration below, all of it felt distant, and he said quietly, "Margaret, I did not expect to see you here." And I felt my breath catch slightly, because the way he said my name this time was not formal, it was personal, and I asked, "I am sorry, have we met?" And he nodded once, slowly, and said, 19 years ago, Naval Intelligence Advisory Panel, Norfolk Briefing Facility," and something shifted in my memory, faint at first, then sharper, like a photograph developing, and I remembered a room, documents I had been asked to consult on during my final years of service, not as a witness, not as a participant in ceremony, but as someone brought in quietly for evaluation of operational family estate exposure cases tied to service members. And I looked at him more carefully now and said, "You were part of the review board." And he nodded. "I was." And then he added, "And you were the subject matter consultant who flagged inconsistencies that prevented 3 unlawful estate transfers from being executed." And I felt a strange stillness come over me, because that version of myself felt like someone I had not thought about in years, someone who existed before grief, before retirement, before the slow settling of life into something quieter, and Hannah looked between us now, her confidence visibly eroding as she said, "What does any of that have to do with today?" And the Admiral turned slightly toward her again and said, "Because if she signs anything in this room, you will not be dealing with a family dispute anymore. You will be dealing with a documented chain of invalid authorization that triggers federal audit escalation." And Laura immediately looked down at the document again, her hand tightening, and said, "That is consistent with what I am seeing." And I felt the room tilt again, not physically, but emotionally, because suddenly every word from the last hour was no longer isolated. It was connected, and I asked quietly, why would my son be involved in something that requires federal oversight? And before anyone could answer, the Admiral looked directly at me and said something that made the air feel heavier than before. "Because your husband's estate was never just family property, Margaret. It was once part of a protected advisory structure tied to military contracting disclosures." And I stared at him, unable to fully process it, and Hannah's voice broke slightly as she said, "That is impossible." But he replied calmly, "No, it is not impossible, it is just hidden." And then he turned slightly toward Laura and added, "And if you continue this process without verifying original authorization lineage, you are not validating a marriage agreement, you are activating a historical transfer clause that was never meant to be triggered in civilian context." And I felt my phone vibrate again in my hand, Daniel's name appearing once more, but I did not open it immediately, because for the first time, I understood something I had not understood when I walked into this hotel suite, that I was not simply reacting to my son's wedding, or a lawyer's warning, or a fiancé's confidence. I was standing at the center of something that had begun long before today, and the Admiral looked at me again, more quietly this time, and said, "Margaret, whoever brought you here today did not expect you to still have access to the truth." And in that moment, I realized that whatever was waiting downstairs in that ballroom was no longer just a ceremony. It was a trigger point for something none of them fully understood yet. And then the Admiral added one final line that made everything inside me go still, "And I am afraid your son may not know what he is signing either." The Admiral's words did not leave the room. They stayed in it, suspended like something unfinished that no one dared to resolve. And I remember standing there in that Atlanta hotel suite feeling as if the air itself had changed density. Heavier now, slower, and every person in the room seemed to understand we had crossed an invisible line that could not be uncrossed. And Laura Bennett was the first to move, not toward me, not toward Hannah, but back toward the table, opening the folder again with a precision that felt different now, almost urgent. And she said quietly, "We need to verify the original execution chain immediately." And Hannah's voice sharpened slightly as she responded, "There is nothing to verify. My father has already confirmed the structure." But the Admiral raised his hand gently, not as a command, but as a correction, and said, "Confirmation from a party involved in the transfer is not verification, it is assumption." And then he looked at me again, and for a moment I felt like I was being measured against something I could not yet see. And he said, "Margaret, I need to ask you something directly." And I nodded slowly. And he continued, "During your husband's final years, did you ever sign any document related to estate restructuring, even informally?" And I shook my head immediately. "No, I did not." And my voice surprised even me with how certain it sounded, because I remembered every signature, every hospital form, every financial discussion after Richard's condition declined. And I added, "If I had signed something like that, I would remember." And Laura immediately said, "That is consistent with what I am seeing in the metadata of the filing." And I turned slightly toward her. "Metadata?" And she nodded. "The document that is being used as authorization contains layered certification marks that do not originate from your known legal representatives." And Hannah let out a quiet breath, almost impatient now, and said, "This is becoming unnecessary. The wedding is starting in less than 1 hour." But the Admiral turned to her with a calmness that made her stop speaking mid-sentence, and he said, "Young lady, what is starting downstairs is no longer relevant if what is being executed here is invalid at origin." And I felt something inside me tighten again, because that word, origin, did not belong to a wedding conversation either. And I asked quietly, "What exactly are you all saying happened to my husband's estate?" And Laura hesitated for the first time since this began, then said carefully, "We are saying there may have been an unauthorized substitution of trustee authority during the transition period after your husband's passing." and I repeated slowly, substitution, as if saying it again might make it clearer, and she nodded, yes, but not in a way that is normally visible through standard probate review. And Hannah immediately responded, that is impossible. Everything was handled through licensed counsel. And Laura looked at her directly and said, then your counsel will have to explain why your name appears on a secondary beneficiary endorsement that did not exist in the original filing set. And I saw Hannah's composure shift for the first time, not fully breaking, but adjusting, like someone recalculating a position they thought was secure, and she said, that endorsement is standard in blended estate planning structures. But Laura shook her head, not with this signature pattern, and she turned the document slightly toward me, and I saw something I did not understand immediately, a series of initials and markings layered beneath what looked like my husband's name, but slightly off, as if traced or reconstructed, and I asked, what am I looking at? And Laura answered softly, a replicated authorization sequence, and the Admiral exhaled slowly and said, that is not a civilian estate construct. And then he looked at me more carefully again and said, Margaret, I need you to try and remember something very specific. And I nodded, even though I did not know what he was going to ask. And he continued, did your husband ever mention working with naval-affiliated contractors during his business years? And the question landed differently than anything before it, because it pulled something from memory I had not visited in a long time. And I remember sitting back slightly and saying, Richard worked in logistics and infrastructure, nothing military-related after his service years. But even as I said it, I felt uncertainty begin to form, because there were conversations I had dismissed at the time, mentions of contracts I did not fully understand, phone calls he would take quietly in another room, and I added slowly, he did have clients he did not always discuss in detail, and the Admiral nodded once, as if that was the piece he needed, and he said, that is where the structure begins. And Hannah immediately stepped forward again, her voice rising just slightly now. This is ridiculous. My father is not involved in anything military connected. And the Admiral turned to her and said calmly, then your father should not have access to legacy-coded estate identifiers tied to Department of Defense-affiliated trusts. And the room went quiet again, and I felt something inside me shift from confusion into something closer to recognition, not full understanding, but the sense that I was looking at the edges of a shape I had once known. And Laura spoke again, softer now. Mrs. Collins, there is something else you need to see. And she flipped to the next page, and I leaned forward slightly, and what I saw was not a single document, but a timeline, a sequence of filings stretching back years, overlapping signatures, reference codes I did not recognize but somehow felt familiar. And at the center of it, not at the beginning or end, but embedded like a pivot point, was my name, Margaret Collins. Not as owner, not as beneficiary, but as authorized observer designation, and I looked up immediately and said, what does that mean? And the Admiral answered before Laura could, it means you were never meant to control the estate, Margaret. You were meant to verify it. And I felt my breath slow, because that sentence did not explain everything, but it confirmed something far more unsettling, that I had been placed into a structure I did not design. And Hannah whispered, almost to herself, if she is an observer, then the transfer cannot proceed without her acknowledgement. And Laura looked up sharply at that. That is correct. And suddenly the room changed again, because for the first time, I was not being told I was irrelevant. I was being told I was necessary. And I felt my phone vibrate again, Daniel's name flashing on the screen, but this time the message was longer. And when I read it, my hand tightened instinctively, because it said, Mom, if they are asking you to acknowledge anything, do not, no matter what they show you, because I think I finally understand what Dad was protecting you from. And I looked up slowly from the screen, and all three of them were watching me now, waiting, as if whatever I chose to do next was no longer just a family decision, but something that would determine which version of the past would be allowed to exist in the present. And in that moment, I realized the truth was not fully in this room yet. It was still arriving. The silence after Daniel's message did not break immediately. It expanded, like the room itself was holding its breath. And I remember standing there with my phone still in my hand, feeling the weight of everything I had just read, settle deeper than anything before it, not fear, not confusion, but a strange clarity that made the edges of the situation sharper. And around me the room was no longer just a hotel suite in Atlanta. It had become something closer to a courtroom without a judge, where every person was waiting for a version of truth that had not fully arrived yet. And Laura Bennett was the first to move again, stepping closer to the table and speaking in a controlled but urgent voice. "We cannot wait any longer. The activation window is tied to the ceremony timeline." And Hannah Whitmore immediately turned toward her composure now visibly strained, and said, "There is no activation window. This is a wedding, not a legal proceeding." But the Admiral Thomas Grayson did not look at her. He was watching me, and he said quietly, "That assumption is what people always say right before they realize they are inside one." And I felt something inside me shift again, because for the first time I was not reacting emotionally. I was listening, and I asked slowly, "What happens if I do nothing?" And Laura answered immediately, "Then the transfer proceeds automatically through default authorization logic." And Hannah snapped, "That is not true." But Laura raised her voice slightly for the first time. "It is true when layered estate protocols are structured across jurisdictions." And the room tightened again, and I could feel Hannah's control slipping, not dramatically, but in small fractures, like glass under pressure. And she turned toward me fully now and said, "Mrs. Collins, whatever they are telling you, it is being exaggerated. My father has handled complex trusts for decades." And I looked at her, not with anger, not with fear, but with something calmer, something steadier. And I said, "Then your father should have no problem explaining why my name appears as an observer in a document I never signed." And for a brief moment she did not respond, and that silence mattered more than anything else she had said. And I continued, "Because I remember every financial discussion my husband and I ever had. And I remember being told that everything was simple after his passing, and I remember trusting that." And my voice did not rise. It did not shake. It simply stayed steady. And that steadiness seemed to affect the room more than emotion ever could. And Laura looked at me and said softly, "This is exactly why your designation matters, Mrs. Collins, because you are the only verified continuity link in the original structure." And Hannah immediately interrupted, "That is nonsense. She is not part of any structure. She is a widow being manipulated by legal theater." And I turned slightly toward her and said, "No, I am someone who is trying to understand why my son told me not to sign anything before I even knew what I was being asked to sign." And that sentence changed something in her expression, because it was not defensive, it was factual. And I saw her glance briefly toward her phone, as if expecting someone to correct the situation. And then the Admiral stepped forward for the first time in several minutes, and his voice was calm, but absolute. "Mrs. Whitmore, I suggest you contact your father immediately." And she frowned. "Why would I do that?" And he answered, "Because whatever structure he believes he is controlling is now being challenged by federal-level verification protocols." And I watched her confidence finally crack into something closer to uncertainty, and she stepped back slightly, saying, "This is supposed to be a controlled transfer." And Laura responded immediately, "It was controlled until multiple jurisdictions flagged inconsistent authorization lineage." And I looked at Laura and asked, "What does that mean in plain terms?" And she hesitated, then said, "It means someone tried to move assets using your husband's estate structure without fully validated consent chain integrity." And the words sounded technical, but the meaning was simple enough. Something had been moved that should not have been moved. And Hannah suddenly raised her voice slightly, not fully breaking, but losing precision. "This is not about consent. This is about prearranged family agreements." And the Admiral turned to her and said, "Then those agreements will need to withstand federal audit scrutiny, because what you are calling family arrangement intersects with classified legacy trust protection frameworks." And I saw her step back again, and for the first time she looked less like someone in control and more like someone realizing she might not understand the system she thought she was operating. And then Laura did something unexpected. She closed the folder halfway and said, "We need to pause execution." And Hannah immediately reacted, "You cannot pause anything. The ceremony is already in motion." And Laura looked at her directly and said, "Not if the observer refuses acknowledgement." And then she turned to me, and the room followed her gaze, and I felt it, all of it converging, every thread in this room narrowing down to a single point. And I asked quietly, "If I refuse, what happens?" And Laura answered, "Then nothing finalizes today, but the structure collapses into review status." And Hannah's voice sharpened again, "You are not going to stop this." And I looked at her, And for the first time I saw past her certainty. I saw urgency underneath it, and I said calmly, I am not stopping anything. I am simply asking what I am agreeing to. And that was the moment the balance shifted, because it was not defiance, it was clarity, and the Admiral nodded slightly, almost approvingly, and said, that is the correct posture. And then his phone rang, and he looked at the screen, and for the first time since entering the room his expression changed, not into surprise, but into recognition of escalation, and he said quietly, we now have confirmation from Norfolk archival verification, and Laura immediately asked, what did they find? And he looked at me before answering, and said, they found that the original trustee authorization chain does not end with your husband, Margaret. And I felt the room go still again, and Hannah whispered, that is impossible. But the Admiral continued, it extends backward to a pre-existing military-affiliated estate safeguard protocol that predates his civilian filings. And I heard my own breath slow, because something in that statement felt like a door opening in my memory. And I asked, and what does that mean for me? And Laura answered gently, it means your signature is not approval, it is release. And I stared at her and said quietly, release of what? And no one answered immediately, because in that moment, even the people who had come prepared to explain everything seemed to realize they were still missing the final piece. And then my phone vibrated again, and this time it was not Daniel, and it was not Laura. It was a number I did not recognize, and the message contained only one sentence. If you acknowledge anything today, you will unlock what your husband spent his final year making sure stayed sealed. And I looked up slowly, and every person in the room was watching me now, waiting, because whatever came next would not just decide a document, it would decide what truth I was allowed to see. The message on my phone did not disappear. It stayed there glowing faintly in my hand like a warning that refused to be ignored. And I remember standing in that Atlanta hotel suite feeling a silence that was no longer empty, but crowded, as if every decision I had made in my life had suddenly gathered in one place to watch what I would do next. And no one in the room spoke for several seconds. Not Laura, not Hannah, not even the Admiral, because something had shifted again, not toward clarity, but toward fracture. And then Laura finally said quietly, we are beyond internal validation now. And Hannah immediately turned toward her, her voice sharper than before. What does that mean? You said this was controlled. And Laura answered without looking at her. It was controlled until external audit escalation triggered jurisdictional conflict review, and I watched it happen in real time, not the legal explanation, but the collapse of certainty, because Hannah's expression changed first, just slightly, her eyes tightening as she said, my father will not allow this to escalate. And the Admiral responded calmly, your father does not control federal archival verification. And that was the first moment Hannah stopped speaking immediately after a sentence, as if her words had run out before she expected them to, and she looked down at her phone quickly, typing something, and I could see the shift in her posture, the subtle loss of composure that happens when someone realizes they are no longer inside the system they thought they controlled. And then she said, this is being misinterpreted. Daniel would never allow this kind of exposure. And Laura finally looked directly at her and said, Daniel is not the controlling party anymore. And those words hung in the air like something irreversible, and I felt something inside me tighten at the mention of my son's name, because for the first time I understood he was not simply involved, he was being positioned. And then the Admiral stepped forward slightly and said, we have confirmation from Norfolk that the authorization lineage is incomplete, and Hannah immediately responded, that is impossible. Everything was signed under legal supervision. But Laura interrupted her this time. Supervision does not equal authorization integrity, and I watched Hannah turn slightly away from us, and I could see it now. Not anger, but calculation turning into instability, and then something unexpected happened. Her phone rang, and she answered immediately, her voice changing as she said, Father? And the room went even quieter, because now the source of control had entered the conversation indirectly, and we could hear only her side, fragments, her pacing voice growing more tense as she said, no, they are saying the Norfolk verification did not clear. Yes, I understand what you told me. No, I did not expect federal escalation either. And then she stopped walking and said more sharply, you told me it was sealed. And there was a pause, and whatever came through that phone was not audible, but it changed her expression completely, and she said, that is not what you said last week. And I saw it then. The first crack that was not legal, not procedural, but relational, because whatever alliance she thought she had was now unstable, and she lowered her voice. Are you telling me you did not fully disclose the observer designation? And that phrase made Laura immediately look up, and the Admiral narrowed his eyes slightly, and I asked quietly, what did she just say? But no one answered me yet, because Hannah was still listening, and then suddenly her voice rose again. You told me she would never be activated, and that sentence landed differently than anything before it, because activated was not a legal term I understood in family estate planning. And I looked at Laura, and she looked back at me and said softly, that is not standard language. And then Hannah's phone call ended abruptly, and she stood still for a moment, staring at the screen. And then she said something I did not expect, not to us, but almost to herself. He did not tell me about activation thresholds. And then she looked up, and for the first time her confidence was gone completely, replaced by something closer to panic control, and she said, this is not what I was promised. And Laura immediately responded, that is exactly the problem, and I could feel the shift now, because the room was no longer divided between lawyer and client, or fiancé and family. It was dividing into something else. And then Hannah suddenly turned toward the Admiral and said, you need to understand. I was assured this would remain within private jurisdiction, and the Admiral replied calmly, you were assured incorrectly, and then something happened that I did not expect at all. Hannah turned back toward Laura and said, you knew this would escalate, and Laura shook her head. No, I knew it could escalate, but not that it would trigger legacy observer validation. And then Hannah said the words that revealed everything was now breaking apart internally. My father is going to destroy this entire structure if this reaches audit level. And in that moment, the illusion of unified intent shattered. Because now it was not just one group against another. It was each of them protecting themselves from the consequences of something they all touched, but did not fully understand. And I stood there realizing something very quietly. I had not needed to argue. I had not needed to accuse. I had not needed to raise my voice once, because the system itself was beginning to fracture under its own weight. And then Laura turned to me and said softly, Mrs. Collins, you need to understand something important right now. And I looked at her, and she continued, everything that is happening is now dependent on whether you acknowledge or refuse observer status confirmation. And I asked quietly, and if I refuse? And she hesitated, then said, then the entire structure halts and enters forensic review. And Hannah immediately snapped, you cannot allow that. But Laura replied, I do not allow anything. I only report system behavior. And the Admiral added quietly, at this stage, nobody here is in control anymore. And that was the moment I understood the truth was no longer hidden behind them. It was emerging through them. And my phone vibrated again, Daniel's name appearing once more, and this time the message was shorter, and it said, Mom, if you trust me at all, do not confirm anything they call official, because I think the truth they are showing you is only half of what exists. And I read it slowly, and when I looked up, all three of them were watching me, waiting, not as allies, not as opponents, but as people standing on different sides of something that had already begun to collapse. And for the first time, I realized that whatever came next would not be controlled by any of them, not even the ones who thought they had started it. The room did not feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like something after the storm has passed, but before the world decides what to become again. And I remember standing there in that Atlanta hotel suite with my phone still in my hand, Daniel's last message lingering like an echo that refused to leave, while Hannah Whitmore stood near the table in a silence that no longer carried confidence, and Laura Bennett kept her eyes on the documents, but no longer with urgency, more with caution, as if she was waiting for the system itself to decide what it would allow to happen next. And the Admiral Thomas Grayson was the first to speak again, but his voice had changed slightly, less directive now, more reflective, and he said quietly, at this stage, continuation is optional, but consequence is not. And I felt those words in a different way than before, not as pressure, but as release. Because for the first time since I walked into this room, nothing was demanding immediate action from me. And I looked at Laura and asked softly, if I do nothing now, what happens to my son's wedding? And she hesitated, then said, the ceremony proceeds, but the legal structure remains unresolved and will surface later in a different jurisdiction. And I nodded slowly, not because I fully understood it, but because I understood enough to realize that every path forward now carried cost. And Hannah suddenly spoke, but her voice was no longer sharp. It was uncertain. This is supposed to be finalized today. Everything was prepared for today. And for the first time, I saw her not as someone in control, but as someone watching control disappear, and Laura replied calmly, "Prepared does not mean valid." And then there was a long pause, and in that pause I felt something shift inside me, not toward fear anymore, but toward distance, like stepping back from a fire that no longer needed to be fought. And I looked at the Admiral and asked, "When you said I was an observer, what did you mean by that in real terms?" And he took a slow breath before answering. "It means your role was never ownership or approval. It was continuity verification, a safeguard placed at the final point of trust transfer." And I let that settle in my mind. And for the first time, I was not trying to solve the situation. I was trying to understand my place in it. And I asked quietly, "So if I refuse to acknowledge anything, I am not stopping it. I am only not completing it?" And Laura nodded. "That is correct." And in that moment, something in me softened, not emotionally, but structurally, like a weight I did not realize I was carrying had finally been identified. And Hannah suddenly said, almost under her breath, "My father is going to lose everything if this goes into review." And there was no arrogance left in her voice now, only concern, and I turned slightly toward her and said, "Then maybe the question is not what I do, but what was done before I arrived here." And she did not respond, and that silence mattered more than any argument. And then the Admiral stepped forward and said something unexpected, not about law, not about structure, but about time. In systems like this, resolution is rarely about action, it is about release. And I looked at him and said, "Release from what?" And he answered, "From responsibility that was never fully explained to the person carrying it." And those words stayed with me longer than anything else that day. And for a moment I closed my eyes, and I was no longer in Atlanta. I was somewhere else entirely, somewhere quieter, and I saw flashes of a different life. Not events, but feelings. My husband Richard sitting at a kitchen table late at night, reviewing papers he never fully explained, telling me, "Some things are better left structured than discussed." And I remember laughing at the time, thinking it was just his way of avoiding stress. But now it felt different, and I opened my eyes again, and Laura was watching me carefully, and she said softly, "Mrs. Collins, whatever you decide, I need you to understand that there is no punishment mechanism here, only outcome." And I asked her, "And what outcome do you think I am supposed to choose?" And she hesitated, then said, "The one that does not require you to carry something you were never meant to carry alone." And that sentence landed differently, because it was not about law anymore. It was about life, and I felt something inside me loosen, not break, not collapse, but loosen, like holding something too tightly for too long, and finally realizing it was not mine to hold forever. And then I looked at Hannah, and she was no longer speaking, only watching, and I realized she was not my opponent anymore. She was someone caught inside the same structure I was only just beginning to see, and I said quietly, "I did not come here to destroy anyone's wedding," and my voice stayed calm. "I came here because I was told I am part of something I do not understand." And Laura nodded, and the Admiral said, "That is accurate." And I exhaled slowly, and for the first time I felt a decision forming that was not reactive, not emotional, not defensive, and I said, "Then I choose not to sign anything I do not fully understand." And there was no drama in it, no declaration, only clarity. And the moment those words left my mouth, the room changed again, not explosively, but quietly, as if something internal had finally aligned. And Laura closed the folder gently and said, "Then the activation sequence pauses." And Hannah sat down slowly without saying a word. And I could hear the faint sound of music beginning downstairs again. The wedding still continuing in another world, unaware that the foundation beneath it had just shifted into review. And I walked toward the window again, not looking at the documents anymore, not looking at anyone, just watching Atlanta move beneath me. And for the first time that day, I was not trying to understand a secret, I was simply letting go of the need to carry one. And behind me, I heard Laura say quietly, "She is out of the chain now," and no one corrected her, because for once, there was nothing left that needed to be forced into motion. The moment I chose not to sign anything, the room did not explode. It softened instead, like a pressure that finally had somewhere to go. And I remember Laura Bennett closing the folder slowly, not with triumph, not with relief, but with the careful precision of someone who understands that silence after a legal turning point is never empty. It is full of consequences already moving in different directions, and the Admiral Thomas Grayson stepped back slightly, his expression no longer analytical but distant, as if the system he had once served was now continuing without his supervision, and Hannah Whitmore stood near the table holding her phone tightly, staring at it as if it had become heavier than she expected. And then it rang again, and this time I saw her answer with hesitation instead of control, her voice breaking the pattern she had maintained all day as she said, "Yes, Father." And whatever came through the speaker did not need to be heard by anyone else for the shift to be understood, because her posture changed immediately, the certainty she carried earlier dissolving into something far less stable, and she said quietly, "You told me this was already secured." And then there was a pause, and she repeated, "You said she would not matter." And I realized in that moment that whatever structure had been built around this day was no longer holding, not because I had broken it, but because it had never been as solid as they believed. And Laura looked at me gently and said, "The review process has already been triggered at Norfolk archival level." And I asked softly, "What happens now?" And she replied, "Now everything that was assumed becomes something that must be verified." And there was no drama in her voice, only the quiet truth of procedure overtaking intention, and I felt something inside me settle, not into victory, but into understanding. Because I was no longer inside a moment of crisis, I was inside the aftermath of a system correcting itself. And then the Admiral spoke one last time, his voice lower now, almost reflective, and he said, "In my experience, Margaret, people think these moments are about winning or losing, but they are never that simple. They are about what remains when control is removed." And I looked at him and asked, "And what remains in this case?" And he answered, "Only truth that can be verified without permission." And for a moment no one spoke again, until my phone vibrated and I saw Daniel's name appear. And this time I answered, and his voice came through immediately, tense but grounded. "Mom, are you still upstairs?" And I said, "Yes." And there was a pause before he said, "Do not sign anything. I am coming up." And I remember sitting down slowly as I waited, not because I was weak, but because I finally no longer felt the need to stand in defense of something I did not yet fully understand. And when Daniel entered the suite, he looked different from how I had seen him in years, not powerful, not distant, but exhausted in a way that suggested he had been carrying multiple versions of responsibility at once. And he looked at me first, not at anyone else, and said quietly, "I tried to stop this from reaching you like this." And I asked him, "From reaching me at all?" And he did not answer immediately, and that silence told me more than words ever could. And then he said, "I did not know they would use the observer clause." And Laura immediately responded, "That clause is not standard in civilian estate planning." And Daniel nodded slightly, "I know." And for the first time I heard honesty in his voice instead of explanation, and he looked at Hannah briefly and then back at me and said, "This started before the wedding, Mom. I just did not understand how far back it went." And I felt something in me shift again, not toward blame, but toward recognition that even he had been inside something larger than he could see clearly. And Hannah finally spoke, her voice quieter now. "My father said this would be a simple consolidation." And no one corrected her this time, because the word simple had lost all meaning in this room. And then Laura said softly, "The estate is now in forensic review, which means no transfers, no confirmations, and no finalizations until lineage verification is complete." And I nodded slowly and said, "So nothing moves forward?" And she replied, "Not until truth is fully reconstructed." And I let that settle inside me, because for the first time, forward or backward no longer felt urgent. And what mattered instead was clarity. And Daniel sat down across from me and said quietly, "I am sorry, Mom, not for what happened today, but for not understanding what you were being pulled into." And I looked at him for a long time, not as a child anymore, not as a man who had built distance, but as someone standing inside consequences he did not fully create but still had to face. And I said, "I do not need you to fix this." And he nodded, and I continued, "I only need you to stop assuming I cannot understand it." And he closed his eyes briefly and said, "I understand." And for the first time in a long time there was no negotiation between us, only recognition. And the Admiral stepped toward the door and said, "My role here is complete." And before leaving he looked at me and added, "You handled this correctly, not as praise, but as confirmation." And Laura followed shortly after, saying, "You are no longer part of the active chain, Mrs. Collins, your designation is closed. And when the door finally shut, the room felt larger, not emptier, just less pressured, and I stood and walked to the window again, watching Atlanta continue as if nothing had happened above it, and Daniel came beside me quietly and said, "The wedding is still happening downstairs, but everything is different now." And I nodded, because I understood that truth does not always stop life. It simply changes its weight. And later, when I finally went down briefly into the ballroom, I did not announce anything. I did not explain anything. I simply stood at the edge of a celebration that had shifted into something quieter, more uncertain, and Hannah's father was no longer present, and guests were speaking in lower tones, and I realized that power does not always fall loudly. Sometimes it simply leaves the room without explanation. And when I returned to my hotel suite alone later that evening, I found an envelope on the table I had not noticed before, left by housekeeping or perhaps by someone who no longer needed to be visible, and inside was a single document copy marked "Review Initiated," and beneath it, a pen that I recognized as Richard's, the one he used for important signatures, and I held it for a long time, not because I needed it, but because it reminded me that not everything in a life is meant to be signed. Some things are meant to be understood and released, and I placed it back on the table beside the unopened wedding program that had been left in the suite earlier that day. And I remember standing there looking at both objects, one representing a future that had tried to define me, and one representing a past that had always been more complex than I was told. And I finally understood something quietly. That peace is not the absence of conflict, but the moment you stop carrying conflicts that were never yours to hold. And I want to say to anyone listening who has ever felt pulled into stories written by others, trust is not about surrendering yourself. It is about knowing when to step out of a narrative that no longer respects your truth. And if you are watching this from somewhere in the world right now, I hope you remember that your clarity matters more than anyone's expectation of your silence. Thank you for listening to this story. If it resonated with you, feel free to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below, and maybe tell me where you are watching from, because sometimes realizing we are not alone in these moments is the first step toward healing. And the one lesson I carry from that day is simple. You do not lose yourself by walking away from confusion. You find yourself in the space it leaves behind. And there are more stories waiting here that may speak to your own experience. If you choose to continue listening, and for now, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to this story.